So my name is Pamela Moore, and I am a member of Pittsburgh Friends and Erie Worship Group. And I'm going to talk about Anthony Benezet, who is one of my favorite historical figures. So I think it is generally agreed among belief scholars that Anthony was the start of the anti-slavery movement in Philadelphia. He wasn't the first person to protest, but he had a very big influence on so much. He had, I call it like a four-pronged approach. He did education, direct service among Black people, Native Americans, and women. He very big on direct education. He had published a lot of writings. He had local connections to high-profile people, and he had a lot of international correspondence, which really nobody else at the time had. He was friends with both Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin, and he engaged them to become abolitionists. He wrote to religious people, English Parliament, and I guess he, along with then John Willman, kind of moved the Philadelphia Yearly Meeting along into anti-slavery sentiment. And according to his biographer, Maurice Jackson, Benezet, and I call him Benezet because Dr. Jackson called him Benezet, and he thought that was what he was called. He translated ideas from the diverse sources: Enlightenment philosophy, African travel narratives, Quakerism, practical life, and the Bible. All this meshed into concrete action. So he's French. I think that it's possible that the idea of calling him Benezet, because his father changed his whole name when they moved to America. They were Huguenots, and I don't know if people are familiar with, there was a law in 1585 letting Huguenots own property and vote and stuff like that. But in 1685, that was rescinded, and now Huguenots are, pariahs. You have to be Catholic in France as of 1685. There's no more civil or religious freedom. So his family was pretty wealthy. Anthony's family, his father did very well. He was very wealthy, but their estate was seized, and they fled to Rotterdam, where I think they didn't feel real welcome, and then to London a couple years after that. And they came to Philadelphia in 1731, and Anthony was about 18 at the time. His father was also started out being a Quaker. I think you would call him a nominal Quaker, but then he met some Moravians, and he left the monthly meeting and joined the Moravians in 1743. And then he was disowned by Philadelphia Monthly Meeting. After that, Anthony also joined the Quakers. Unlike his father, he was not nominal. And then 5 years later, he married a Quaker named Joyce Marriott. And she was distinguished as having been recognized as a minister at the age of 18, which I think was probably very unusual. And in the first years of their marriage, they had 2 children, and both of them died before they were 2 years old. And Anthony and Joyce also were vegetarians. They advocated for the kind treatment of animals. They didn't want any products that could have been made by slaves. They had a garden in their yard. They raised a lot of their own food. And Lois asked me to talk a little bit about his involvement in Quaker meeting. Actually in Philadelphia Monthly Meeting, but he actually was a member of a few monthly meetings, because after they got married, him and Joyce moved to Wilmington, and he went into business with his brothers in some sort of manufacturing, and that didn't work out, and he wasn't happy about that. But so we see their Wilmington meeting. Then when he moved back, they moved to Abington. He got Abington meeting. Then presumably moved to Germantown, so he's Germantown meeting. I'm assuming that he was at the meeting went to the meeting near where he lived, and then they didn't move to Philadelphia until 1753 or something like that. I think he became a weighty friend like pretty quick, because he within a couple years, maybe it was Joyce's, influence, though, him and Joyce became the Clearness for Marriage Committee. And then he was like promoted to overseers, which now is care committee. But at the time, overseers was like the enforcer, have to visit people when they had bad business dealings or fraud or suspected of drunkenness or anything else. And they would visit people and deliver what they called Christian brotherly advice. And then the person was supposed to go to the meeting and apologize. And if the person didn't apologize, they were disowned. So he was involved in visiting and disowning people, including people who supported the revolution. And that even included one of his best friends, Sam Forthingill, who swore allegiance to the new revolutionary government. Anthony visited him, and he also was suggested the meet with him before disciplining him. And he was hoping that Sam would, acknowledge that he had made a mistake, but he didn't. So he was disowned. And then he went on to found the Free Quaker meeting down the street from Arch Street. And that's this way. Okay. And so this slide is about finding his way in to be a teacher. He got the job in Germantown in 1739 when they moved to Abington. And then in I think that was a Friends school in Germantown, a Friends school. And in 1742, he got the position of, I think, the master of the Friends English School in Philadelphia. Now that's the prestigious Penn Charter School up in Germantown. And then 1745, they moved back to Germantown from Abington. The school, and then 1750, he continued to work at the English school, but he set up an evening school for Black young people in his home. And that continued for 20 years. He thought that given an opportunity, he could prove to people that Black people were just as smart as white people and could learn. And he actually proved that to be right. And 1750 also is around the time he started kind of his abolition work. And Absalom, I don't know if people are familiar with Reverend Absalom Jones. That is a portrait of him. He attended Anthony's evening school when he was maybe around 16. And he went on to be the founder of the African Episcopal Church of St. Thomas. And him and Richard Allen were the most prominent Black clergy and Black leaders of the late 18th century. And the other thing I want to say about Anthony and education, he was not the typical teacher. It was very much a time of discipline, Quakers and everybody, spare the rod and spoil the child type of thing. He did not do that. His method of teaching was based on kindness, and he got to know each of his students and motivated them after he got to know them, like what would motivate this person individually, and worked that way. And he loved all of the children in his school, and they loved him too. And then in 1754, he left the Friends English School and he started a girls' school. And that was the first public girls' school in America. It was a Quaker school, and it was free. And he taught there on and off till 1766. He was I guess he had such a good reputation as a teacher from the Friends English School that a lot of prestigious Philadelphians sent their daughters there. Like, I think Deborah Norris and Sally Wistar, those are old Quaker families. I think Deborah Wistar was married to James Logan. They went, and a bunch of prominent people went to that school, but anybody could go to it. He even devised a special program for a deaf child at the girls' school so that she could learn, kind of as well as everybody else. He's like a tremendous amount of empathy. And in 1766, he had poor health and moved to Burlington. And, there are several times in his life that he had poor health. And none of the writings ever said what exactly this poor health was all about. So I don't know. But they moved to Burlington. Apparently they had built a house there previously. And they stayed for a year, and he came back and opened a school for poor girls in 1767. And he ended up teaching there till 1782. So and now we come to the African Free School. So Anthony, by 1770, when he convinced Philadelphia Monthly Meeting to open the African Free School, he was already a very weighty friend. He had already proved to people that blacks could learn as well as whites. So it might not have been a big stretch to get the Monthly Meeting to set up a school. And it's called the Raspberry School now. Well, it's not anymore. It was operational for 100 years, and I tried to look for it. Raspberry Street is no longer a street, but if you go down 3rd Street and I think between 3rd and 4th, there's a corner of Willing's Alley. There is like an unnamed little alley, and that's possibly it was on that street, but we don't really know. He didn't actually teach at that school for until almost the end of his life. There was a guy named Moses Pemberton was the first teacher, and he came out of retirement to teach there when they couldn't find a teacher in 1782, and he stayed there until his death only 2 years later. And the success of this school inspired the Abolitionist Society to implement more schools. And James Forten, if you're from Philadelphia, you probably heard of James Forten. He was a very prominent abolitionist and a shipbuilder, and was the father of Harriet Forten and Charlotte Forten. He attended the African Free School. I can't see my title of my slide. Okay, but so in addition to being an educator, he wrote tracts and also children's books. You can see that. I looked at 2 of those children's books. You can find them online, like they have most of the words still in them. But the one that I got the cover of it's a modern cover, the Pennsylvania Spelling Book. And then he had a first book for children. And that starts out with like just sounds, look like for children, ba, ka, and then it goes on to like little words. And then it goes on to words with 2 syllables, putting a hyphen between them. And then in the middle, there's like a lot of biblical literature and references that I guess he wanted the kids to read, but they're pretty interesting to look at. And he also wrote, some obviously he would have had been on a Quaker Quaker education committee, because he wrote these tracts on education. And so how did he come to protest slavery? I was just interested in what motivated him to be, because he did this for 34 years tirelessly. So I found out that he read a lot of those authors of the Enlightenment. Most of them were Scottish moral philosophers, and humanists, and they really felt that slavery was, against the rights of man. And so he studied a couple of those philosophers, Francis Hutchinson and George Wallace. And George Wallace's work was based on the theory that the more prosperity people have, the more they will want, the more they will acquire, and the further from utopia they will get. And I think Anthony really resonated with that, because he lived a simple life. He identified with the Native Americans and poorer people, and And so he read a lot of the Enlightenment. Then he started reading about the geography and culture of Africa, and also the slave traders' journals. I mean, the slave traders, some of them were totally shameless. They published their journals and told about all the horrible things they did to Africans, and how they plotted to deprive them of their property and steal them. So he read all of this, and then he studied the geography and culture of Africa, and so the writers at the time were kind of, like, I guess, justifying slavery, saying, oh, these Black people are uncivilized, they don't have family values, they sold their own children. And that really, none of that was true. And so by reading and then eventually writing, and he could correct these facts that that Africans really had an ideal climate. They could provide their own food. They were very peaceful, and they were very family centric. But this didn't, at the time, Europeans were starting to go with manufacturing and wealth. And, if you weren't toward what they call progress, then you were not considered civilized. So he tried to counter that in his writings and in his readings. He also talked to Africans in Philadelphia, and he learned from many people that family was highly valued in Guinea, which is the name of Africa. And so, I mean, I think one of the primary horrors of slavery was like tearing apart families. And I think he could really relate to that, having lost 2 children and having to flee France. So he was just, I don't know, he was just very far ahead of most people at the time. And first of all, his the Quaker values, like a love and concern for your fellow man, and being a tolerant and affectionate teacher, and being influencing Quakers, and then internationally known. He had really these 4 things that he would, 4 characteristics that, or skills, or both, that he used in his work that inspired him. And now I just have to mention that he wasn't the first guy to protest slavery. And John Willman certainly was like along with him. John Willman mostly let his work lie with Quakers, visit, Quakers all throughout the country. Anthony took it a step further. But, there was the Germantown protest, 1688. Then George Heath wrote his pamphlet and was disowned, 1693. And then William Southby wrote a pamphlet, 1718, I think, and was disowned. And both George Heath and William Southby were disowned because they didn't get permission to publish their pamphlets. Well, Anthony, now he's on the publishing committee and he's on the epistle committee. So I don't know, like maybe that Quakers just came to a different time by 1750s, or maybe he was just more inspirational and maybe a more weighty friend. And I mean, they had just disowned Ben Lay in 1738, and now 1750, Anthony's talking to them about slavery, and it's a little bit more, they're just a little bit, people are more receptive. And he wrote an epistle, him and John Willman wrote an epistle to the yearly meeting in 1755, demanding that the slave trade, just the slave trade, not slavery itself, be prohibited among Friends. And the epistle was published, and there was no directive to stop trading enslaved, but Friends were then discouraged from trading enslaved. And from Anthony, even though a lot of this early writing was directed at Quakers, he also wrote to other prominent people in Philadelphia, the English Parliament, the Queen of England, a bunch of people in England, and King of Prussia. He was kind of all over the place. He knew that he had to go beyond Quakers if he was going to be successful in promoting anti-slavery. So this is his proclamation. This is his quote as what his position on racial equality. And that was, saying that, unequal, saying that blacks are inferior is a vulgar prejudice founded on ignorance, and who have kept their slaves at such a distance as to be unable to form a judgment of them. And like that was even unlike most Quakers really didn't get to know black people as people. I think, you know, later on they might have, but at the time, Quakers like had, even if they agreed that slavery should be abolished, they really didn't see any equality coming down the pike. So he was unusual in that regard. He, I already just gotta look at my notes for a second. So some of the things he did, well, like you see, he influenced Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin. He founded the first anti-slavery society, and that, which is now the Pennsylvania Abolition Society, which is still going on today. He also wrote the very first anti-slavery article to be published in a newspaper. It was published in 1775 in the Pennsylvania Journal, and it was called "The Slavery of Negroes in America," and it called for the abolition of slavery in all of the colonies and the end of the slave trade worldwide. Now, the anti-slavery, you know, I guess movement or kind of was not as prominent during the Revolutionary War. So it's pretty shortly after he founded that first anti-slavery society, they had a few meetings and then they stopped meeting for a while. But before that happened in 1772, this is in Philadelphia yearly meeting, he rose to speak about the slave trade. And after he got done speaking, the yearly meeting united with the emancipation policy, meaning that Quakers in Philadelphia yearly meeting were prohibited from holding slaves and must emancipate them. So he started this crusade in 1750, 1775. The yearly meeting finally says no more slaves. I mean, the long haul. And somebody quoted that possibly from the minutes and said, Benezet at the meeting rises with a crucified expression and weeping like Jose for the sins of his people, voiced the plaint of an oppressed race and asked for justice, admonishing the meeting with the words, Ethiopia shall soon stretch out her hands unto God. That's from Psalm 68. And after he is done, you know, the yearly meeting decides to unite in that policy. And I think we've all been at a yearly meeting sometime where there's been some fiery speaker that moves everybody and suddenly a decision is made. So in these are the list of his anti-slavery pamphlets, and I wondered what was in these pamphlets that was so compelling, because there have been other pamphlets. So in the most influential pamphlet was the one called Some Historical Account of Guinea in 1771. In that one, he pointed out the discrepancies between the geography and culture of Africa and the myths that were being perpetrated by the slave traders, that Africans were heathens and uncivilized. And so he was like countering that with facts, and people were very moved by that one. And he, in that pamphlet and others, he used the slave traders' own descriptions of the cruel treatment of the enslaved, and as examples of European barbarism. So kind of ironic, you know, that Europeans are saying that the Africans are barbaric, but it's really the Europeans. And then in the other pamphlet, A Short Account of That Part of Africa, I think those two pamphlets did talk a lot about Africa more than the other ones. And I think people might have been really like, you know, like got an aha moment. My gosh, this is true. And the things we've been believing all along are not true. But in that one, he argued against those who attributed slavery to the enslaved people themselves, because that was also a popular thing. They're slaves because they can't do anything else. They were easy to to capture. Their only family sold them. So he countered all of that. And he also reported that the Dutch actually hired some people in Africa to go out and gave them guns and arms to go out and capture other tribes in Africa. And those people that they captured were the enslaved people that were taken to America. He quoted Leo Africanus, who is a Moroccan historian. He said that he's describing Africa. They lived in common, having no property in land, no tyrant or superior, but supported themselves in an equal state upon natural produce of the country, which afforded plenty of roots, game, and honey. The ambition and avarice never drove them into foreign countries to subdue and cheat their neighbors. And in contrast to, like, I think a lot of people, even in America, he admired that culture. He related that more than he did to the rising merchant class in Philadelphia. And also, you know, his own history of being persecuted, although he was only 2 when they had to leave France. So I'm going to just talk a little bit about, and keep an eye on the time here. Okay. Some of the people that collaborated with him, that he engaged to collaborate. And really one of the big ones was Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin, you know, of course, was in England for most of this time that Anthony was corresponding with him. So they were writing from England, but he knew him from their mutual friend, Christopher Sowers, who was also a publisher. And also, I think Anthony's brother married Deborah Franklin's cousin. So they did know each other. And he wrote to Ben Franklin, sent him pamphlets. And then Ben Franklin, like, more and more kind of came around to the idea that Anthony was right. And by the 1780s, he was arguing that it was society's duty to educate Blacks because they were not responsible for what slavery had done. However, Franklin had slaves. During this time, he took 2 slaves with him to Europe and left one at home, which after his wife died, got passed down to his daughter, and he did not free his slaves till 1781. So this is a very, like, another mystery to me. He is becoming, like, more and more an abolitionist, but either he came to it very late, or, you know, he felt like he could still own slaves. I do not understand that, and that would be a good thing to understand if somebody wanted to research that. But Ben's last public act, I think that was the time they had to carry him to Congress on a days because he couldn't walk. He petitioned Congress to abolish slavery and restore liberty to Black people, which, of course, that went nowhere in Congress. And the other guy that was really prominent in Philadelphia, I have to turn on the light in my dining room a little bit because it's getting dark now. Ooh, just hang on a sec. I'll make it a lower light. That's just enough. Okay, it was Dr. Benjamin Rush. I think if you're from Philadelphia, you would have heard of him. He was the most prominent physician in colonial America. He signed the Declaration of Independence. He founded the study of psychiatry. And Anthony sent him pamphlets. I don't know if he knew him or if that was a strategic thing on Anthony's part. But he read Anthony's pamphlets and then became an anti-slavery advocate. But he also owned a slave. And while he owned a slave, William Gruber said he bought him as a child, which I was looking, it had to be around 1770, and he ended up manumitting him in 1793. So, but all this time, Benjamin Rush is writing to people in England, and sending copies of pamphlets, writing his own pamphlets. And and he also petitioned various assemblies. So he learned all this from Anthony, to how to petition assemblies in the colonies and in England, because, you know, at most of this time we were still under the rule of England. And Anthony like urged him to write a pamphlet, which is at the last thing on the last bullet there. It was to increase the duty on slave importation, and he didn't really want to do it. I don't know if he thought maybe his, you know, that would be, he would be too prominently out there, and maybe wouldn't have a good reputation. I'm not sure why he didn't want to do it, but he finally did it anonymously. And then as a result, they doubled the tax on slave importation, and that had a big impact on the slave trade, because it was getting too expensive. And after he did that, then other states and colonies, other colonies kind of followed suit, and Vermont wrote their constitution in 1777 saying that slavery was a violation of natural, inherent, and inalienable rights. And then Pennsylvania in 1780 became the first state to emancipate the slaves, and which didn't have any, you know, didn't have any national significance, but other states then, or other colonies, followed in their footsteps. So that pamphlet did have some fallout, you know, did have some impact. And they got, Benjamin Rush and Anthony got into a back and forth pamphlet with some guy, Richard Nesbeth, who was writing on behalf of slave owners, and they were countering him. And then they would send him their pamphlets, and they would send the pamphlets to all these other people, and they were just developing like a network. They were getting bigger and bigger, the network of people that they could send things to, and then they send them to their friends. And then he even wrote to Thomas Paine, who he wrote essays on slavery. In addition to Benjamin Rush and Benjamin Franklin, he also wrote to Patrick Henry and John Jay, and they said we agree with you in principle, but they never, they did not free their slaves. And John Jay he argued for emancipation of slaves in 1777. I think he was the governor of New York at that time. And he also founded an African free school in New York, but he kept his own slaves until 1810. And so that is like the mystery to me of all of this reading, is how these people could say slavery. And then Thomas Jefferson did it too. You know, he did agree in principle slavery is wrong and we should eventually abolish it, but he had lots of slaves. And well, the last thing I want to say about Benjamin Rush, he wrote an essay called, I think he wrote it after Anthony died though, Paradise of Negro Slaves, a Dream. He wrote it about his dream that dead enslaved people came to him and instructed him to carry back their horror stories to the white people. And I guess it became known as Anthony Benezet's Dream. Now, let's see, these are just a few of his international correspondence. Granville Sharp was a civil servant in London, and I guess that means he just worked for the government, and he had apprenticed with the Quaker, so he had some kind of humanism about him. And one day he's walking down the street and he sees a black teenager that had been severely beaten. He took him to his brother, who was a doctor, and who treated him. And after the child was healed, the guy that said he was his owner wanted to get him back, and Granville got involved with his legal defense. And during the trial, he happened upon one of Anthony's pamphlets, a short account of that part of Africa, and he used it in the trial, and he won. He won just for that guy. He didn't win for all people, but the Chief Justice said that this person could not be taken into slavery. And so then he wrote more pamphlets. He became a very big anti-slavery. He started writing to Anthony, they were writing back, they're writing to Benjamin Rush. And so since he's in England, he sent the pamphlets to the prime minister, and then he sent his own 250 copies of his own pamphlet to Ben Franklin, who then sent it to Philadelphia. And then the guy at the bottom is Olada Equiano. I hope I'm saying his right. He was a former slave. He lives in London. He had been owned by a Quaker, and he was the most influential African writer at the time. He paraphrased. That was a little later. You know, he was a little more like the late 1770s, 1780s. He wrote his own pamphlet. And it was called The Interesting Narrative of the Life of Olada Equiano, or Gustav Basu, the African. And in it, he described family life in Africa and maltreatment of the slaves. And he proposed that they have an end to slavery and have a trading commerce between Africa and the Americas. That he really thought that, and you can see he's a very fashionable dresser. He thought Africans would really want to adopt English dress in fashion and customs, and that they would want to buy these goods in England, and in return they could send produce. And he thought that will work out pretty good for people. And he actually came to Philadelphia in 1785 and visited the African Free School. And William Wilberforce was a political leader in England, and he was influenced by Benezet's writing and the other people's writing. And now there's like a lot of writings. There's a lot of pamphlets, and that is the main way anybody got information across in those days. No internet. And so I thought it was kind of remarkable that they established this large network of people without benefit of telephone, internet, anything like that. And so Wilberforce, he moved to abolish the slave trade in Parliament, and he was defeated, but he kept doing it, kept at it, and Parliament finally passed the Slave Abolition Act in 1825 and the British Emancipation Act in 1834. And this, two other people, John Wesley on the left. Is my left your left? I have that. All right. I get. Well, he's the white guy with the long hair. He's, you probably know of him. He's the founder of Methodism, or one of the founders. And Anthony wrote to him. I don't think he knew him, but he thought he needs to go beyond Quakers if he's gonna, especially in England, needs to. In England, there were not as many Quakers. And of course, in Pennsylvania, there was a lot of them at the time, but he wanted to expand anti-slavery beyond Quakers. So he wrote to John Wesley. Then John Wesley wrote his own pamphlet called Thoughts on Slavery, based on Anthony's pamphlets. Then Anthony had John Wesley's pamphlets published in Philadelphia. And then he wrote his own pamphlet called, Observations on John Wesley pamphlet. So maybe they're taking it all a step further. But it's kind of like maybe a magazine, like the latest issue from John Wesley or Anthony Benezet or Granville Sharp, But Wesley's pamphlet in England led to 229,000 signatures on a petition to Parliament opposing slavery. And it didn't pass Parliament at that time, but it did show that the English people really did oppose slavery. And this last guy, at least the last one that I'm going to talk about, is Quobna Atoba Quoeno, and I don't think I'm saying that right. But he was the second most influential African writer, and his claim to fame, he's the first African, or the first American, or the first anybody to criticize European imperialism in the Americas. And he was a little later. He's in the 1780s. Anthony had passed, but he read his pamphlets and was influenced by him, and wrote his own book called Thoughts and Sentiments on the Evil and Wicked Traffic of Slavery and Commerce of the Human Spirit in 1787. And Quomna, he was stolen into slavery at the age of 13 and taken to, I think, Grenada, where he experienced and witnessed the horrible mistreatment and beatings of slaves. And somehow he got to England, and a few years later, I think he was in slavery for 3 years. And he became an English citizen 3 years later. And so in his book, he could talk firsthand about the horrors of slavery and also remembering the beauty and the resources of Africa and its people. And he just also disputed the myth that Africans sold their wives. And he described a very family-centric culture. And he gave a really positive portrayal of Africa before the Europeans came. And he wrote to newspapers, members of parliament, European nobility. He was very, very active in anti-slavery. He proposed that blacks be indentured for 7 years and then be free. And then he also was a proponent of sending them back to Africa to be useful. In addition to these guys, Anthony's writings were also published in France, and France set up their own society for Friends of the Blacks, only in French, which my accent is bad, so I won't say that. And so you could see anti-slavery societies are forming in France, in Britain, and maybe other countries. And a lot of this is due to Anthony's writing and sending these pamphlets and starting this small network. So in addition to his work with Africans and African Americans in education, he also was an advocate for the Native Americans. He took notes at a conference in 1760 as early and gave that to his friends, kind of dispelling some of the myths people have about Native Americans. He also went into the forest a lot and visited Native Americans, and they came to visit him. He was present at the Treaty of Easton, where the Native tribes agreed to support the British instead of the French. But I don't think he was involved in the British negating the treaty. But he was there when it was signed. And he published a pamphlet about Native Americans and also left money for their education in his will. Okay, I'm not hurrying along. Well, and so there's some couple of his community activities, especially the second one. That was a pretty big deal. That in November 1755, the Acadians French were expelled from Nova Scotia, and a bunch of them were sent to ships in Philadelphia, and he was put in charge of them, I guess. And he got government grants, houses built for them. He went on the ships and he found that they were, in desperate need of food and clothing. So he got donations, and he helped them, establish themselves in Philadelphia. And he got some criticism from fellow Quakers, especially when the refugees refused to settle elsewhere than Philadelphia. So I don't know if Quakers didn't want Acadians. Well, they weren't Quakers, so, maybe they don't want them there. And then some of the refugees suspected him of ulterior motives. And so that added to his difficulties. They thought he was going to sell them into slavery. But despite all this, he persisted and helped them get settled in a new place. This is just some of the last of his writing. So I think it's upwards of 20 pamphlets he wrote. These are his spiritual writings. And this is his house. On the left is the drawing of his house, and on the right is 325. They say 115 Chestnut. It's really 325. That's what 3rd and Chestnut looked like in 1753. And this one, can you see the top? They're pointing to it. This is in, I think, 1879, how much Philadelphia had built up by then. And his house is still standing. It's not standing today. He died on May 3rd, 1784. It was a giant funeral. And what it was like, I guess, really special about it is there were over 400 Black people attending his funeral. That was a very unusual at the time, for any cultures to be mixing at a funeral. But and then, of course, the Pennsylvania Gazette wrote a tribute to him a couple days later, and he was buried at the Friends Burial Ground in Philadelphia, which now is the Arch Street Meeting House site. And as all of the graves in that site, there are no markers, so we don't know which one is him. But we do have a marker. We got a marker at 3rd and Chestnut, at the site of his house. How did we get this marker? Well, about 2009, Maurice Jackson, who is a professor at Georgetown, he wrote a very comprehensive, detailed biography of Anthony Benezet. And he came on one of his book signings with Haverford College. So we all went and got our book signed and heard him speak. And it was I found it to be very inspiring. And so a few years later, this friend of Mignon's, Dan Flanagan, was a librarian. I think he called her and said, Mignon can interrupt me if I'm like, not getting this little part right. But he said that he had identified the site of Anthony's home, and wouldn't we want to apply for a marker? And he said he had done this before. And he could help us with some kind of the politics of what you have to say to the historical society. So with help from him and from Dan, and using Dr. Jackson's book, I wrote the application. We got it approved in 2016, and this is our unveiling. You can see a bunch of Quakers there, and the guy in the suit is from PHMC. And Dr. Jackson graciously agreed to come and be our speaker. So he came up from Georgetown and spoke at the interment installment of the marker. And there's Dr. Jackson speaking at the dedication. So that is my presentation. I think I'm on time. Do you have any questions? Do I stop sharing now?
That was absolutely great.
No, I don't want to stop video. I want to stop sharing. How do I stop sharing? Boop, boop, boop. Okay. No questions? Hi, Hazel. Oh, Clemence has a question.
Yeah, everything I've read about the Quaker abolitionists in Philadelphia talked about, yeah, it's a good thing, but never talked about African Americans being people worthy of being free in and of themselves. Did you get a sense that Benezet felt that way?
No, he didn't feel that way. He was unique among friends. He felt that he felt that Blacks were worthy of freedom, and that slavery and even unequal treatment was abominable. But not that he was not the majority of Quakers, and he was not even the majority of abolitionists. Although I think later on, but this was later on, way into the 19th century, when the abolition societies really took off. They were mixed with the Black and white people, and so the Motts and the Purvises and those people were more of Anthony's ilk. But even back then, you were not allowed to meet at Quaker meeting houses, and so that Anthony was unique in acknowledging the equalness of everybody.
Mm-hmm. I think that his Huguenot background, even though his parents fled from central France to Rotterdam, and he was a very small child, based on my experience with the Huguenots in central France. They were much more about equal rights, and he would have carried that through, because the Dutch who accepted those Huguenots ended up in South Africa, and they were just the antithesis of freedom for Africans. So I'm just really fascinated by the fact that he actually lived in Europe a very short time, but those ideas of a certain amount of freedom, that he was able to carry them across the Atlantic.
Hi,
Hazel's hand is up.
oh,
I can't see. Oh,
Oh.
whose hand is up?
It's Hazel.
Oh,
So I have a quick question. I was a little late to getting. So the school that he started in, that he originally started at his home, is that what became Raspberry School?
no, the
Or was
school
it a
in his
different-
home was his own school, free school in his home. And wherever he lived at the time, which was several places, the Raspberry Street School was the one he convinced the Philadelphia Monthly Meeting to start a school, and he had already convinced them that Black children were equally able to learn as white children from his school in his home. So he had convinced them, and so they were willing to start a bigger school.
So was his school the school for Black people and their descendants?
I hadn't heard that.
I'm curious if that was the net. I'm just trying to figure out where that particular.
I haven't heard that one. I heard the African Free School and the Raspberry Street School. Those were the names of them that I had read.
That you came across. Okay. Well, because somebody even at the meeting left money to the school for Black people and their descendants. So I'm just trying to figure out where in the middle, that came in. But
And it was an actual school. Like they left it as like not just leaving the money to Black people and their descendants, but an actual physical.
No, the name of the school for Black people and their descendants.
Oh, we'll have to look that up. I'll look it up.
So I think that's something I need to investigate.
If you got money and it has to go there, yeah.
Cool. Thanks.
Oh, Carol, is your hand up? You're muted.
Thanks. So when he formed the Anti-Slavery Society, do you have an idea of what the membership was like? Were there other Quakers from the monthly meeting? Did he draw from the community for membership?
It was a few people, and it was Benjamin Franklin, Benjamin Rush, and a few people. I don't remember if there was anybody from the meeting or not.
Great, thanks.
I don't see any more hands. Oh, Susanna?
Yeah, I'm fascinated how they were all talking to each other. Now, of course, Francis Pistorius, 1688, he was long before. But there must have been a trail from Francis Pistorius to Anthony Benezet.
Yeah, there was a trail. There would be, George Keith. He wrote a big pamphlet in 1693. Then this guy, William Southby, which I would love to learn more about him. He was advocated for end of slavery in the late 1690s, and then was disowned for writing a pamphlet in 1718. So there definitely was some previous activity.
Yeah, and I like how you brought in William Wilberforce, who of course was very important in England, along with someone called Smith, who was a grandfather of Florence Nightingale. So Yeah, it's great how they all connect. Yeah. That's a fabulous story. Gosh. He must have been very charismatic. I guess
I
he
think
was.
he must have been. I mean, he was very humble. Even his dying words or something like, I'm not worthy of, something like that. He is a very humble but persistent. And yeah, it's so hard to, in historical figures, you read about them, you want to get an idea what they were really like. And I don't quite get that from him.
So he was never frivolous or funny. He was just incredibly serious all the time.
I don't know. He might have been funny.
I can't imagine he would have been. I mean, for him to succeed the way he did, he must have had very good person skill.
He was kind and he was good with kids. And so, I mean, I think he would have been persuasive with adults. And, like Benjamin Lay, people, he was not doing that at all. So I can definitely see people just thought Benjamin Lay was a big annoyance. And, Anthony, I think, had more diplomatic skills for sure.
Yeah. Wow. Yeah. Gosh.
So you are over your time.
Well, thank you very much, Pamela. And also, since I walk by that historical marker every once in a while, I always stop and look at it and think about how we managed to get that done.
I know, that was a nice time.
Yes.
Well, thank you, ladies, for doing it.
Now, Pamela, did you know that there is a national historical marker cleaning day?
No.
Apparently it is. It is next Friday. I believe it's Friday or Thursday this week. Because we're cleaning the ones outside the meeting house. And who's going to clean that one? I guess I should go by and see what it looks like.
Does PHMC do it, or do they give volunteers?
I think they get volunteers, but apparently it's a thing, which I just found out this year. So I guess that's why they kind of look blue, very blue sometimes.
Hazel, is that the Cherry Street Meeting House or the Arch Street Meeting House?
Arch Street Meeting House. That's where I am. Yeah. So we're having a little cleaning party, I guess.
Oh, I have to add one thing that I just remembered. On Friday, on March 22nd, 2 days ago, it was the 150th anniversary of the abolition of slavery in Puerto Rico. They didn't abolish slavery till 1874, and they abolished it with conditions. Anyone who was still a slave still had to work for nothing for 3 years, and whoever owned slaves got a whole lot of money as compensation. It's pretty shocking. So there was, well, I was on the plane flying here, but that was a big.
Well, thank you for inviting me. This was great fun.
Thank you for a very informative session.
Yep.
Thank
Have
you
a good night, everyone.
Thank you, Pamela.
And enjoyed when the sun eclipse.